Hi everyone and welcome back to my Consultants Explorer channel. I'm Charlie and I'm here to help you explore the early career years of technology consulting, how to be successful at it and how to make the most of the opportunities that it presents for you. I spent 8.5 years at Accenture building the most incredible launchpad for my own career, and now I get to choose what I work on whenever and wherever I want to in the world. And that's the kind of freedom that I can help you find in your journey, which starts just as minded in technology consulting. So today we're going to cover the first part of a two-part series on managing risks. Risk management is one of the most important things you will ever need to do in consulting because it's crucial to the successful delivery of projects. It's also something that you need to be good at very early on in your consulting career, because if your leadership can trust you to both identify and raise risks, then they can trust that you can own your deliverables. And that means that you can have more responsibility faster and your career development will accelerate. In this part one, we're going to cover what a risk is, how to identify a risk, and whose responsibility a risk is. In part two, we'll then cover raising a risk, mitigating a risk, and how to close a risk. So first, what is a risk, and what are some examples? In consulting, a risk is something that might get in the way of your deliverable being completed on time. And if your deliverable slips for any reason, then it might impact the completion of other deliverables by other teams who are dependent on you. Overall, this might create a delay to your project, which might then negatively impact your client's business, and it might also affect whether your company meets its milestones to get paid. So what are some examples of risks? I would categorise the risks I saw during my time in consulting into 4 main groups: phase delay, absence, human error, and then unknown or unforeseeable constraints. We'll dig into some examples of each group here, and then in part 2 we'll cover how we can mitigate those example risks. Phase delay is a really common one. In a typical tech consulting project, there are lots of pieces of work that have to happen chronologically in order to deliver the new tech. If any one of those pieces of work is delayed for any reason, then there are knock-on impacts to those that are dependent on it. For example, if an integration isn't delivered on time, then business users can't test the end-to-end user journey. Or if the UX is behind schedule, then requirements handed over to tech teams aren't depicted properly on wireframes. Or if you just ran out of time to write the requirements you needed to, then the technical teams can't set about building them. The second group is absence of key personnel. Multiple people need to be involved in a project so that the project team has all the right skill sets and experience and all the right stakeholders. If a client stakeholder is unavailable and they are the only designated stakeholder with the required knowledge to complete requirements, then we have a risk. Or if an approver is unavailable at the time that a key decision needs to be made, then that decision is at risk. Or if someone on your team is long-term sick, then there is a risk that their work will not be completed. The third group is human error. Perhaps someone in the UX team forgot to add links to the clickable prototype, which means it's not working properly, and it's confusing the technical teams who are trying to build the functionality. Or maybe one of the BAs misunderstood the client requirement and wrote it down wrong because they didn't want to ask the client to repeat themselves, which means the technical teams are risking building the wrong thing completely. Or maybe even politics between client stakeholders is actually meaning that they can't come to a conclusion on nomenclature for the new system functionality, which is risking that build can't even start. The final group is unknown or unforeseeable constraints. By nature, these are some of the hardest risks to predict and to mitigate in advance. For example, it might be only in trying to build the capability as per the business requirements that technical teams discover quirks with the technology that means it's just not possible, risking their ability to complete the build. Or perhaps due to external circumstances, your client's business need changes during the course of your project and you have to redo some requirements gathering and build accordingly. Or perhaps there's a third-party team upon which your project is dependent and for some reason they take a decision that puts your dependency at risk. Okay, so now we've been through some examples of risks in these 4 groups. How do we actually identify these risks? First off, it's worth being aware of when they might occur and the kinds of things that increase them. In terms of when they might occur, although they could happen at any time, typically they're most pronounced or obvious when a deadline is near. And so the skill, or challenge, is to try and spot them as early as you can before that deadline so as to have the best chance of mitigating them. There are some set things that increase the chance of risk. Things like absence, deliverable delay, distractions, miscommunication or misunderstanding, misalignment, and poor management. So if you start to see any of these happening, you have the chance to think critically about whether they're starting to present any risk. But the best possible thing you can do to spot any risks within your own work is to be absolutely clear on all of the steps between now and achieving your deadline, and to always track your progress versus that plan. For everything that's within your control, ensure you're sticking to your plan or an appropriate replan. And for anything outside of your control that your work has a dependency on, then make sure you're staying up to date on how that's tracking, and you know that if there's any problem or delay in that you have a risk. So let's say you've identified a risk. What next? Whose responsibility is it to do anything with that risk? If you've spotted a risk and it directly impacts your ability to do what you're supposed to do, then it's definitely within your remit to raise it. If, however, you've spotted a risk that doesn't directly impact your ability to do your work, then rather than formally raising it, you might speak to the people whom it does impact so that they can raise it. We'll cover how to raise and mitigate risks in part 2, but a final note now to conclude part 1. When does a risk become an issue? A risk becomes an issue when it's no longer possible to mitigate and advance the impact of that risk. Remember, a risk develops into an issue if nothing is done to mitigate it. When it's an issue, the impact identified with that risk is now being felt, which usually means something negative is happening. So in summary, we've talked about what a risk is, and we've explored 4 different groups of risk. We've covered when risks might occur and how to identify them, and we're clear on whose responsibility it is to raise a risk. If you'd like to hear how to raise and to mitigate risks, then head on to part 2. But before you do so, if you found this useful, then let me know by clicking the like button. And if you'd like to see what I post next, then definitely subscribe to my channel. Social media links are below if you'd like those. And if you have any questions, then feel free to use the comments section below, and I will do my best to answer absolutely everything. In the meantime, I hope you have a great day. Thank you so much for listening, and I wish you all the best with your exploring.